Well, a few years ago, in an attempt to get an edit approved by a client, I brought a gun to a meeting and pulled it on him and told him that the gun was there to protect his brand identity. And it didn't really go down too well. It was a fake gun, it was a replica automatic pistol, it wasn't a real gun. So it didn't have the effect that I was hoping it would have, because it actually made him more determined to change the edit. So what I learned from that, I should have brought a real gun and shot the
So there were some main learnings that we picked up from all the interviews that we did. This kind of shows you in terms of, there was areas in cock-ups and creative ideas, misplaced enthusiasm, a lot of poor attention to detail where people are ballsed up, ballsing up around client relationships and probably not being honest. Truth in advertising was a really interesting one with this, an era where we can retouch things and make things look like they actually aren't. And also things about forgetting about money. I thought this was a really good quote, because I think in our industry, making cock-ups and failing at things is one of the most important things that we need to do. If we're generally a creative culture and we want to be innovative, the only way you can actually do that is to make mistakes. Our main learning out of all this information that we've got is if ultimately our job as agencies and clients is to do innovative and creative work, the most important thing is that we actually create environments that allows people to do it. So the main thing I think the panel we're going to discuss today is, how do we actually do that? How do we make people around us feel comfortable to do that? Have you ever actually fired anyone for making a similar mistake? And where do you actually draw the line in allowing people to make balls ups in your team?
It's a good question. No, I don't think I've ever fired anybody for making a mistake, although I'm sure I felt like it often. But I do think there's a pretty obvious line between someone who's taken a risk and it hasn't paid off, and a living, breathing, walking retard, right? And they're reasonably easy to spot. So no, I don't think I've ever fired anybody for making a mistake. But there is a difference between a brave risk taker who didn't pull it off and someone who's just not very good at the job.
It's not always that easy to spot the retards, I've found. But no, look, I think exactly that. If it's a mistake that was a genuine one and was about truly trying to explore something to get to a better place and it didn't work out, well, you can't fire someone for that.
I'm Damian's favourite client by far, because I'm into anything and up for everything. But no, I've never had to fire anyone. And at the moment, probably the more cock-ups I've had than anyone is with you guys in the works. and yet, you're our valued creative lead agency. So I think it's important that if you don't let people push you, then you get nothing.
I've never sacked anyone for that. In fact, you might turn around and say, why would you do that? Because, in fact, you've just cost me quite a lot to train you very well. But you've now got experience, you've been through the experience of something that's gone wrong, and in a way that's the best training you can have. So it would be quite the reverse probably, I think, unless that person was going to be a serial problem, then I wouldn't sack them. But I've worked in environments which I think unfortunately have been the reverse to risk taking. They've been risk averse. So actually I'd be more inclined to sack someone or to move them on if they weren't taking more risks.
The CEO had asked to see some alternative routes in this week's creative presentation. The agency CEO at the time and I hatched this cunning plan where we'd cobbled together the cuttings from the creative room floor into the worst piece of advertising we could think of, present that as the alternative route, and presume the CEO was finally going to see the light and buy our brilliant creative idea. The CEO loved the piece of work that we thought was shit and promptly proceeded to insist that we went and made that. What happened then is that the agency and I spent the next 3 months effectively polishing a turd and then spending a couple of $1 million airing said shiny turd on television.
So my learnings from that, I think 2 things. First of all, never trust the most junior member of team in the studio to get something right on a pitch. And secondly, and more importantly, I think anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So make sure you think about all eventualities.
The lesson: think before you speak.
Well, I think we learned a lot about CEO behaviour. One is that really you shouldn't let CEOs have any say over the script. They're vastly underqualified and have an overinflated view of their own creativity. And secondly, you can never underestimate a CEO's ability to say, make it anyway, and leave you with the results.
When we do great work, there's this adrenaline rush and excitement about an idea. So I think the main question to you guys is, when you've got that fantastic idea, what's that moment of fear like, whether you're going to succeed or fail when you're just about to invest in a big campaign?
I like that feeling. Am I weird?
No.
I think that means we might be onto something, and it's not 100% guaranteed success that if I've got the fear the campaign's going to be good. But I'm struggling to think of an example where I thought everything was going to be all right and we didn't just end up running a safe, boring piece of advertising.
And I think whenever I think of the word risk, I instantly think of reward, because there has to be that balance between how far you're prepared to go with what you're going to get in return, sort of thing. You know, if things fuck up, and they do, blame your agency. No. Actually, that's pretty unfair, because once you're, and I firmly believe this, that if you don't 100% adopt an idea, once you might think, oh, I'm not 100% sure. You got to trust your gut, but once you're in, you got to be in 100%, because you're a partnership, and the blame game is the worst thing you can do when it comes to not accepting the thing. So yeah, you got to commit and be in.
Thanks, Ray.
I think being in a safe area is a very dangerous place to be, particularly for companies these days, because let's face it, most corporates are geared to taking risk out of any situation. But when you look at pretty much any category that exists, parity is pretty much, parity abounds. It's not like in the drinks category where both of these two guys play. There's a lot of difference between one product versus another, and if there is, it doesn't exist for very long. So I think you have to take a risk, and I think great creative thinking is the last legal way to get an unfair advantage in business, and so if you don't take that risk to create something that's going to potentially, let's face it, if you take a risk, it's going to upset people, and they have more means than ever before to complain via social media. But the reality is, if you're not taking a risk, you're playing in a safe zone, then I couldn't think of anything worse than someone not responding to a campaign. So, good or bad, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing for a brand.
I know there should be some fear, particularly on the agency part, for any campaign they're about to run, because hopefully that means they're taking some risks, and hopefully it's an innovative campaign. But on the other side, you've got to remember that you've got to work really hard to trash a brand. There are good examples of that, and I think what it comes down to is understanding what is the one brand value that you have to protect at all costs. So for Choice, that brand value is trust. If we really hit at trust, and we undermine trust that people have in us, then really it's game over. For other organisations, we were talking about Ratner's earlier, the chain of jewellery shops in the UK, which is, it's cheap jewellery. Their brand value, I imagine, was value. Until Mr. Ratner, rocked up and said, actually, a prawn sandwich lasts longer than our jewellery. Now, at that point, he trashed the core brand value. And that's a highly risky strategy. So I would say that, in a sense, fear of a campaign, if you think that it's going to in some way damage your core brand value, well, then don't do it. But you'll be right to be concerned about it.
Joe Talcott talked about getting 4,000 complaints from McDonald's campaign. At what point do you kind of use social media to get an indication of whether things are going right or wrong? Nick, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm not sure in Choice we've got it terribly wrong on social media yet, except I did think we got it wrong about a year ago, and then I realised we hadn't really. We seem to have got a whole load of comments around something that we'd done, an idea that we'd launched, and there seems to be hundreds and hundreds of comments, until I realised that 6 people produced 90% of those comments. And actually, when you then start to sort of, if you interrogate, who is actually commenting, then actually you realise actually this is something that's being completely blown up, and you need to manage that. But you also need to know that the scale of it isn't quite as big as you thought it was. So I think you can sometimes worry about the great numbers of people who are commenting. Actually, then you can distill it actually, and it's down to a very few people. So I think probably the worst thing in many ways about life in general is if people don't comment on you. So in a funny sort of way, I would feel more concerned if actually we launched a campaign or we did something and it got no reaction.
I think the other issue is you can pretty much piss off anyone at any point. No matter it's very difficult to create a campaign that pleases everybody, and I would argue that if you do, then it's probably not a very good campaign because just people don't care. But someone a planner once explained to me that brands are like clubs, and it's important as much as who is in that club as who is not in that club. And I think it's important to rail against that tension as a brand. So by that very nature, sometimes you're going to piss people off, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if it creates some talkability about your brand. Obviously there's degrees with everything, but I don't think you should be afraid of negative comments around your brand.
My biggest marketing cock-up, quite a few of them, but the one that really stays with me was working with a client who was auditing us, putting me under a lot of pressure. She was really, really hard. And at some point I was on the phone and I started scribbling on a business card. I was half aware I was doing it, and I changed her surname to the word wanker, as you do, and forgot all about it. And then about 10 days later, this important documentation we had to send over to her, so I gave it to my PA, and I gave her the business card with the word wanker on it, which I'd forgotten about, and I went to a meeting. Got out of the meeting 2 hours later, and she had taken it upon herself, because she's very good at her job, to write a fax note to the client from Mark Holden to Judith Wanker. So what have I learned from that? 2 things. First thing, if you are going to recruit a PA, get a clever one. Second thing, if you are going to come up with a nice little name for a client, don't use the word wanker. It doesn't work.
Can you actually be a good leader and have flaws?
Esty, but too. Look, mate, I certainly agree with that. It's never an easy thing to do, but I think if you're only a person that talks about all the good stuff you do, people look at you pretty shallowly. And if you talk about the stuff ups that you do, it's certainly, I think it gains you a level of trust with people and also a level of respect that you are human.
I agree. I think it's kind of it's kind of a newer thing in the kind of leadership bullshittery you can read on the internet, but it's one of the ones I subscribe to. I like this notion of authenticity in leadership being actually at the heart of how to do it well. And I think the same is true of brands. I think you'll get more respect from your consumer if you allow your brand to show its dirty underside at times as well, right? And just accept that we don't always get it right.
By recognising what you're no good at, really, quite frankly, or not very good at, hopefully you surround yourself with people who are good at those things. And if not, then your organisation, as much as you are, become delusional. And then you do get, as you said in that clip, a chief executive who thinks that he's creative.
In our industry, do we actually think that we suffer from not taking enough risks?
That's what I love about our industry, isn't it? In the main, we're pretty bloody good at it. There are ways of killing risk-taking in advertising, and I know certainly most of my agency friends would claim research is the death of risk-taking in advertising. That's a conversation for another time. What I love about this job is it's got some creativity at the heart of it, and that in itself is a risk-taking thing. So, no, I think we're in the right place. I think we should populate our industry with risk-takers. That's hopefully what attracts us to do this job.
I think it's a lot easier to take a risk when your brand's going backwards at a rapid rate of knots. So, you get the graph out and you're saying in 5 years' time, if you do nothing, you're there, then suddenly the risk is a lot easier to adopt. But if your brands are tracking really nicely, you've got to have a lot more courage to be able to take that risk. But, reality is you don't know what's around the corner, so you've got to be forever trying to push it. Innovation tends to be the lifeblood of most categories, and innovation is fundamentally a risky business. You can't necessarily learn from the past to build a picture of what the future holds and what's going to work in the future. So I think one of my favourite quotes, and something we talk about a lot at the agency, is one of the greatest sort of innovators of modern time, Albert Einstein,
said, imagination is more important than knowledge, and I think that's true. You have to learn as much as you can, but at some point you have to sort of step off the ledge and go for it, and you just can't do that without taking some sort of risk. So it's important to do in everything we do.